Welcome to Project Command. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and on today's episode, we're going to cover my 3 cheat codes for efficiency. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, it really helps us if you like, subscribe, or share this episode or any episode you found valuable with a friend or coworker who you think might appreciate it. Here at Project Command, we're committed to helping fire departments deliver better projects. And if you have a question or a topic you'd like to hear us cover, send us an email at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. That's projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. We'll do our best to answer it either directly or on air in a future episode. Every share helps more fire service professionals learn the skills and mindset to deliver stronger, smarter projects. So please, help us spread the word and keep the mission moving forward. All right, let's get to the episode. Thanks for being here, everybody. I've got a really interesting subject to cover with you guys today. So today, I want to talk about my 3 cheat codes to efficiency. And what those are basically 3 principles that I've learned in the project management world that I think are really valuable for keeping momentum in a project or just little useful tips that you can use. So I'm going to give those to you today. And the reason I think things like this are important is because, guys, the truth is that running projects is hard and it's complicated and it can be intimidating. And so the trick is whenever you find something that's a force multiplier or that can make your life easier when you're managing a project, it's really valuable. And so that's what we've got today. So what are we going to cover today? Well, I'm going to talk about 3 principles with you. The first is called Parkinson's Law, which states that work will expand to fit the time that you give it. The second that I'm going to cover is called the Pareto Principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. And the last one is the Moscow method, which is a prioritization tool. And each one of these is a little bit different, and they kind of focus on a different element of project management. But as I explain them, I think you're going to see how they all tie together. Okay, so the first one that I want to talk to you guys about is Parkinson's Law. And as stated, Parkinson's Law says that work will expand to fit the time you give it. So what does that mean? Well, this is something that I think we've all probably seen in our own lives where, kind of like, think about it like this. If your boss gives you something to do and they say, hey, I need you to get this done by the end of the month. Well, it's probably going to take you till the end of the month to get it done. But if they say, hey, I really need this done in a week, well, you'll probably get it done in a week. And so the thing to think about here is that whenever we have work or things that need to get done and we're thinking about them in our head, we're always looking for ways to prioritize or to figure out what needs to get done first. So maybe you're thinking about what's the most important or where are the priorities. But one of the critical factors here is we're always thinking about that deadline. And so how does this tie into a project? Well, think about it like this. If you're giving somebody the assignment to review all of your department's SOGs and flag all of the SOGs that are going to need to be updated over the course of this project, and you give them a month to get it done. Well, maybe if they actually sat down and just like got straight to it, it would only take them, an afternoon. But because you've given that artificial deadline of a month, Parkinson's Law tells us that it's probably going to take a month. And so what's the cost of that? Well, it's going to slow work down. You might lose momentum. And generally speaking, it's just kind of wasteful, especially if you have a project that you need to get done quickly. Or even not, even if you just need to get it done at a regular speed or a regular pace or tempo. It doesn't make sense to have work take a month when it could take a week or a day when it could take an hour. So I've talked about several times on this podcast series my preferred way to figure out what deadlines are or should be, which is to just say to the person, hey, I need you to do a review of all of our department's SOGs and flag all of the ones that may be impacted by this new thermal imaging camera rollout that we're doing. How long do you think it's going to take you to get this work done? Because the thing to think about there is just because it's going to take me a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take the person that I'm assigning it to a long time. So I like to let them weigh in and help figure out how long they think it's going to take to get the work done. Now, one quick thing I'm going to say about that is that doesn't always work. Maybe the person has no idea how long it's going to take, and so maybe they're just going to pick an arbitrary timeline and say, "Oh, I think maybe a month." So, if neither one of you really has a good sense of how long it's going to take, one really cool technique that I've used before is called the 3-point estimation technique, which is a way of figuring out. I mean, you can use it for a bunch of different things, but as it pertains to deadlines, this is how it would look. So, you might say, okay, I need you to do a review of all of our department's SOGs and flag the ones that are going to be impacted. Let's come up with a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and a most likely scenario for how long this is going to take. And so maybe you do this as a group, and maybe you just do it with the individual person, and you say, okay, best case scenario, how quickly could you look through these SOGs? And they might say, man, best case scenario, maybe an afternoon. Okay, worst case scenario, how long would it take you? Well, I can't see it taking longer than 3 weeks, so that's the worst case scenario. Okay, and what's the most likely? Uh, Probably 2 or 3 days. Okay, great. So now those are our 3 points: our most likely, our worst case scenario, and our best case scenario. And maybe we give a little bit more importance to the most likely, but now you have 3 points that you can use, and you average those together, or you kind of look for what's in the middle, and that's your ballpark estimate of how long this work should take. And the thing I want to leave you with on Parkinson's law is one of the most critical elements of any project is your momentum. So it's worth taking the time when you're assigning the work or figuring out how long the work should take to pick a good, accurate deadline so that you don't unnecessarily lose time or momentum on a project. So, just keep that in mind. Try to come up with good estimates for these deadlines. And then just remember, you have the 3-point estimation method that you can always use, but that's not the only one. There's plenty of them out there. You just go on ChatGPT and say, hey, what are some basic ways that I can use to estimate deadlines for my project? And it'll list off a few, and then you can look at it and say, okay, explain this one to me. What does this one mean? How would I use this one? So, yeah, just some things to think about there. Control your timeline and don't let work artificially balloon out and take longer than it needs to. All right, let's get to the next one. The next thing I want you guys to know about is the Pareto Principle. Now, you might also hear this called the 80-20 rule, or even the law of the vital few. And now, the law of the vital few is technically a different concept, but it's extremely similar. And so, Pareto's principle basically says that 80% of your outcomes come from 20% of your inputs. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that means in a second, but I want to give you a little backstory on this just because I think it's cool. So, there was a guy in the late 1800s, and his name was Vilfredo Pareto. And he was an Italian economist. And how he came up with this concept was he noticed that 80% of Italy's land was owned by 20% of the population. And after he discovered that, he started to see that pattern recurring over and over and over and over in all kinds of different things. 80% of the problems he was having were coming from 20% of his, activities, and so on and so forth. So where we can see this in the real world is, things like 80% of your uh, apparatus issues are probably coming from 20% of your apparatus, or 80% of the department's disciplinary issues are coming from 20% of the people. Or if we think about a fire ground, think about all the things that are going to happen at a fire. So we have our typical house fire. We got the first in water supply. You've got the placement of the first arriving engine. You've got the first line, the second line, the RIT line. The ladder's going to, put the ladder up in the air. You've got the fan going in, you've got the door's going to have to get forced, the roof's going to have to get vented, you're going to have to set up rehab, you're going to have to overhaul, salvage, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of activities that happen on a fire ground. But if we really think about it, 80% of the value that we deliver on a fire ground comes from stretching that first line and getting water on the fire quickly and, maybe getting good placement for the ladder truck. If you can do those, and maybe water supply, if you can do those few things, there's a pretty high likelihood your fire is going to go well. So 80% of the value on the fire ground comes from 20% of the activities. Now, the truck company people that are listening to this are probably furious, like, no, what we do is critical. Not saying it's not, just trying to illustrate the Pareto principle for you here. So, why is this important for projects? Well, the Pareto principle is deeply applicable to projects. And the reason is that, and for actually, there's two main reasons that I would like to share with you. The first is risks. 80% of the threats to your project are very likely going to come from 20% of your risks. So, we've talked a lot in previous episodes about risk forecasting, and I promise I'm going to do a whole episode on it. But, essentially, you sit down with your project team and you think about all the things that could pose a threat to your project, and maybe you come up with, I don't know, 10 or 15 risks or whatever. There's probably two or three of them that account for the majority of the threats to your project. And, they could be different ones on different projects, but just look for that on your risks. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. And another thing that I want to tell you about with the Pareto principle on projects is if you look at your activities list, and just to take a quick step back, the activities list is if you have your scope, like say you collect your requirements, you put your scope together, you have what's in scope, you have what's out of scope, you're going to then break that scope down into individual tasks or activities. So, for example, you might have, if you're rolling out new thermal imaging cameras, an element of your scope might include training related to those thermal imaging cameras. Well, training is not a task. Training is a category of tasks. So if you were going to break that down into individual activities, training would be broken down into put together a training calendar for all of the people in the field, roll out training to everybody in the field, record a video for Target Solutions, upload that video onto Target Solutions. So you can see where I'm going with this. There's, training, but you can break training down into 4 or 5 or 6 different tasks or activities. Okay, so back to Pareto principle. You have your activities list, which is just all the different tasks or things that you have to do to meet the elements of your scope. The likelihood is that 80% of the value, the total value that you will deliver on that project, is going to come from 20% of those activities. Now, why is that important to know? Well, it's important to know because just like on the fire scene where there's a ton of things that need to get done, there are going to be things that we need to place our emphasis or perhaps give additional resources to. Like, and this is kind of obvious when you think about it on the fire ground, what's more important, getting the first line in service or salvage and overhaul? So the point I'm making there is that understanding critical tasks is really important so that you can know where you need to put your focus and your emphasis and where you need to put additional resources. And so for projects, it's like that also. You'll have tons of things that you need to get done on a project, but there's going to be a handful of them that are really important. And you as the project manager, you've got a lot of things you need to keep your eye on or follow up on or prioritize resources to. And so it's really important to understand what that 20% is. What are the activities that are going to deliver the highest value to you? And so, how do you figure those out? Well, sometimes they're obvious. Sometimes you can just look at this and go, yeah, that's clearly a high value activity. But when that's not the case, I've found that it's really valuable to discuss this with your project team and help just sort of crowdsource that process of figuring out what your priority activities are. Another thing you can do is when you're having that discussion, when you're talking to your team and trying to figure out, hey, what are the activities that we really need to put our emphasis on? What are the things that really have to go right? It's important to frame it from the objectives of the project. And sometimes that can help you see more clearly what the priority activities are. So just kind of go over with your team, hey, let's remember these are the objectives of the project. This is what we really need to get done. So with that in mind, what are our critical activities going to be? And I think when you look at it through that lens, it's a little bit easier to see, all right, this is where we need to put our focus. And that's really the key of the Pareto principle is just helping you figure out, in a world where there's a million things that you as a project manager could be focusing on, what's the best, most important things for you to direct your energy and your resources to? And that's basically it. Okay. The last concept that I want to cover for you guys is what's called the Moscow method. Now, the Moscow method is a really, really cool concept or a tool that you can use to prioritize things like requirements or features or things like that. And what I've found is that very often on fire department projects, you're going to be doing something like, I don't know, maybe you're designing a new fire station or you are specing out a new engine or a ladder truck, and you're going to be limited by your budget. We don't have unlimited dollars, there's no money tree. So, let's say you're designing a fire station. That's the project that you're working on. You might want to have this training prop and this base space, and you might want to put in, this different feature in the bunk room or that different feature, and you're not going to be able to afford all of it. So, how do you decide what you need to have and what you don't need to have? Well, that's where the Moscow method comes in. Now, before we delve into the details of the Moscow method, I want to help frame out how to look at this. So, Moscow obviously is spelled Moscow. So, what I want you to do is imagine the word Moscow in your head. Now, the two O's, I want you to kind of pretend that they're not there, okay? So, I want you to just think about the M, the S, the C, and the W, okay? MSCW. So imagine those two O's are invisible. Now, the M stands for must have. So for a fire station, it's pretty obvious. You must have an apparatus bay, you must have HVAC for the guys, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty obvious what you must have. The next is should have. Should have is a little bit more of a gray area. It's like, man, this is really, really important. It's hard to imagine this fire station without this, but technically speaking, we don't really, really need it. We just should have it. Okay, so pretty close to must have. The next one is could have. So, we could have a high point that we can do, rappelling off of in a mezzanine or something like that. That'd be a really cool thing to have. And if we have the money for it, we could have this. So think about the could haves more like kind of like bells and whistles. Like, oh yeah, if we have the money, I think it'd be really cool to put this in there. Or maybe you want a roof vent simulator behind the fire station or something. And the W stands for won't have this time. Maybe you have another project that you're getting ready to do, which is going to provide a similar value, and you say, okay, well, we're not going to do it on this project because they're going to get it on this next project. Or maybe you just say, hey, look, that'd be really cool, but that's not really in the scope here. We're just not going to have that on this project, or we're not going to have that this time. And so what I like to do is where this comes into play is you're going to collect requirements just like we do on pretty much every project. And you're going to, when you do that, you're going to reach out to all your different stakeholders. They're going to say, hey, we need this. Hey, we need that. Must have this, must have that. And when you run up against that hard wall of the budget, and the budget is like, look, guys, if we were to include all these requirements, we would be way over budget. We can't afford it. We got to figure out what to cut. Now you're going to take that same group of people, your stakeholders, and you're going to explain the Moscow method. You're going to say, okay, guys, here's all the things that we've listed that we could have in this project for, designing the fire station or specking out the new ladder truck. We're going to use a prioritization method called the Moscow method. M stands for must have, S for should have, C for could have, W for won't have this time. And we're going to go item by item, line by line, requirement by requirement, and we're going to, as a team, determine is this a must have, a should have, a could have, or a won't have. And this is a really valuable exercise. First of all, because I think it gets everybody on the same page. Excuse me. It gets everybody on the same page about what the true objectives of the project are. But it also is a really good way for you to determine what we could call a shed sequence. So, let's just fast forward to the end of this exercise. Maybe you had 100 requirements. Now you know, hey, if we have to cut, the very first thing we're going to cut is the won't haves. And then if that's not enough for us to meet our budget objectives or our budget goals, the next thing after that we're going to cut is our could haves. And what this does is it gets rid of the stuff that, is not an absolutely critical factor for success. And it saves the things that, look, this project cannot succeed without these things. So just a really interesting and cool and pretty straightforward way that you can run a prioritization exercise with your team and narrow down what you absolutely have to have and, the rest should have, could have, and won't have. And guys, the reason that I chose these three concepts is because I wanted to give you a tool for each element of the three baselines. And just quickly recall that our three baselines that we're going to have on pretty much every project we do is a scope, a schedule, and a budget. And think about this. I think baselines is something that firefighters and medics and EMTs sort of intrinsically understand. If I tell you that my blood pressure is 150 over 90, is that good or bad? Well, it depends on what my baseline is. If my baseline is 120 over 80, then that's really bad. But, maybe I'm hypertensive and my baseline is 170 over 120, in which case, okay, well, that's actually much better than my baseline, moving in the right direction. So the point I'm making there is that just like with that blood pressure, if you don't have a baseline, it's very difficult for you to understand the information that's coming in because you don't have anything to compare it against. And so just really, really quickly here, we talked about this a bunch, but with the scope, you're going to reach out to all your different stakeholders, maybe through a meeting, maybe through a shared document. You collect all those requirements, must include this, must have that, must include this feature, must be done in this amount of time. You put all those requirements together, and that makes your scope. Okay. Then your scope, which is, broad categories of work, you break that down into individual tasks that must be completed to meet the elements of that scope. Then you figure out your start and your end date for the project, and you plug all those activities in. You'll say, okay, this has to be done at the beginning. This is going to get done in the middle. This has to go after that. This is, and then, by the way, this is where you get your dependent activities. This can't get done until this is done, and this has to finish before this can start. This is also where you pick up your lead and lag, so we're gonna have to wait 2 months for this, so that's a lead, or that's a lag rather. What can we do to cut that time down, et cetera, et cetera. So that's your schedule, and then you take your schedule and you estimate based off of the activities in the schedule. Hey, how long is it, or how much is it going to cost to do this? How much is it going to cost to do that? How much is it going to cost to do this? That's your budget baseline. And so that's just in a nutshell the baselines on a project. And the reason that I like these principles so much is because they directly relate to each element of the baselines. And so Parkinson's law, which work will expand if at the time you give it. So controlling your deadlines so that you don't lose control of your schedule, lose momentum. So Parkinson's law is a great efficiency cheat code for your schedule. The Pareto Principle, the 80-20 rule, is a way of prioritizing activities. So that's a great tool to keep in mind when you're building your scope out. And the Moscow method is just a prioritization method so that you can keep your budget baseline under control by focusing on the critical elements of the budget. And because establishing these baselines is so important, I wanted to give you an efficiency cheat code for each one. And guys, that's pretty much it. Those are my cheat codes, one for each baseline that you need to put together. But I would love to hear your efficiency cheat codes. So please, if you have some, you have a technique or a concept or a tool that you use a lot and you find that it's just a tremendous force multiplier, please email it to me at Project Command Podcast, and we will definitely feature it on a future episode. I'm always looking for those efficiency cheat codes. So guys, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening to Project Command. If you found today's episode helpful, share it with someone in your department or your next project team. Every share helps more fire service professionals learn the tools and mindset to deliver stronger, smarter projects. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and this has been Project Command, bringing command level thinking to every project in the fire service.